The fabric samples could wait. That was the thought running through my mind when my son called me on a Thursday afternoon in late October, his voice carrying that particular tone he only used when he was either very happy or very nervous. 63 years on this earth teaches you to tell the difference, and I had learned my son's frequencies long before he learned to drive. "Dad," he said, "are you sitting down?" I was standing at the window of my home office, looking out over the back property, watching the last of the season's leaves drift off the oak trees my late wife Margaret had planted the year Nathan was born. I pulled the chair out and sat. "I am now. I asked Simone to marry me last night." He paused. She said yes. I remember setting my coffee mug down very carefully on the desk, the way you handle something you don't want to spill. "That's wonderful, son," I said. And I meant it. I wanted to mean it completely. Nathan was 28, an architectural designer working for a firm in Charlotte, doing well, finding his footing. He was good at his job, patient with people, and possessed of a generosity that sometimes made me proud and sometimes made me nervous in equal measure. He had Margaret's eyes and her instinct for trusting people. I had spent 20 years hoping the world would be kind enough to deserve that trust. Simone had come into his life 7 months earlier. He'd met her at a rooftop event hosted by a colleague, someone whose name I never quite caught. She was 25, worked in marketing for a boutique hospitality brand, and she was, without question, a beautiful woman. Sharp features, careful smile, the kind of presence that fills a room and makes everyone in it feel slightly watched. Nathan brought her to dinner at my house in Asheville for the first time in September. I had driven down to Charlotte twice before that to meet her. Casual lunches where she was charming and animated and asked me very few questions about myself, while somehow steering every conversation back to the house, the property, the family. I noticed I filed it away. That first dinner in Asheville, she walked through my front door, looked up at the vaulted ceiling, and I watched her eyes make a slow, deliberate circuit of the room, the way an appraiser's eyes move, not like a guest's. She touched the frame of a painting in the hallway, a landscape Margaret had collected 20 years ago, and said, "This must be worth something. Not this is beautiful. Not where did you get this. Just, this must be worth something." Nathan laughed and squeezed her hand. "She's obsessed with art," he told me, as if that explained it. Over dinner, she asked how long I'd owned the house. She asked whether I had other properties. She asked about my retirement. I had sold my construction company 8 years earlier at 63, after building it for 30 years from a 2-man operation into a regional firm with contracts across 4 states. I told her I stayed comfortable. I didn't elaborate. She pressed anyway, gently, pleasantly, with the practiced patience of someone who has learned that directness makes people close up. I answered what I answered. I watched what I watched. After they left that night, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have seen in that dinner that I might have missed. She had always been the one who read people the way other people read books, quickly, completely, without ever making the subject aware they were being read. I picked up my phone and called my oldest friend, a man named Gerald who had spent 30 years as a private investigator before retiring to tend to a hobby farm outside of Hendersonville. He owed me more than one favor and had never once asked why I needed something. I gave him Simone's full name, her employer, and the city she'd told us she grew up in. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. I gave him 3. What he brought back was not damning on its face, but it was the shape of something. Simone had grown up in Raleigh, not Savannah the way she'd told Nathan. Her employment history had gaps. She had been briefly engaged once before, to a man 15 years older than her, a divorced software executive in Atlanta. The engagement had ended 8 months in when the man's adult children filed a formal complaint through an attorney. The details of the settlement, if there was one, were sealed. Gerald could not get inside that door. But the door existed. There was also the matter of her apartment. She was paying rent that did not align with what her current salary should have covered, in a building in uptown Charlotte that leaned toward the expensive end. Someone was supplementing. Gerald could not tell who. I thanked him and I paid him and I said nothing to Nathan. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I would wait. I would watch. I would give Simone every opportunity to be exactly who Nathan believed she was. And if she was, I would be the first to apologize to myself for the suspicion. What I did not do was enable it. When Nathan called to tell me about the engagement, I asked him when I could meet them for dinner to celebrate. He said they were planning an engagement party at my house, which was the first I'd heard of it sometime in early December. Simone had apparently suggested it. She thought the Asheville property was, and I am quoting my son here, the perfect backdrop. I said that sounded fine. What I did in the weeks between that phone call and the party was quiet and methodical, and not something I told a single person about. I spoke to my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled my business affairs for 20 years. I reviewed the status of my properties and accounts. I updated several documents. Not because I expected anything specific. Because I had spent 40 years building things, and building things teaches you that the time to reinforce a structure is before the storm, not during it. I also bought a very small, very discreet digital voice recorder, the kind that looks like a pen. I put it in the breast pocket of whatever jacket I was wearing and left it there. Not recording, just there, ready. The engagement party was a Saturday in early December. 14 guests. Catered, string lights on the back terrace, despite the cold because Simone had specifically requested outdoor lighting. Nathan had coordinated the whole thing with her and told me what I needed to do, which was essentially unlock the house and stay out of the way while her people set up. Her people turned out to be 2 women I'd never met who arrived with boxes of decorations and spent 4 hours rearranging things in my living room. I stood in the kitchen and drank coffee and watched. The guests arrived around 7. Nathan was glowing the way young men glow when they believe they have found the thing that will complete them. He introduced me to her parents. Her mother was a quiet, pleasant woman named Diane who shook my hand with both of hers and said she'd heard so much about me. Her father had apparently not been able to make it. She did not offer a reason, and I did not ask. Simone worked the room with a precision that I might have admired in a different context. She was warm with everyone, attentive, laughed at the right moments, touched Nathan's arm at carefully spaced intervals. She was performing, and she was very good at it. The audience had no idea they were watching a performance. I had watched enough people negotiate million-dollar contracts to know the difference between genuine warmth and manufactured warmth. The genuine kind is inconsistent. It flares up, falters, gets distracted. The manufactured kind holds exactly steady. Hers held exactly steady. Midway through the evening, when the guests had spread out between the terrace and the living room, and Nathan was deep in conversation with his college roommate near the fireplace, Simone appeared at my elbow. "Can I steal you for a minute?" she said. Her voice was light. Her smile was the one I'd seen 100 times, the one that did not quite reach her eyes. I had started to think of it as her working smile, the tool she kept in the front pocket. I looked at her. I reached into my jacket pocket without making it visible and pressed the button on the recorder. "Of course," I said. She guided me toward the far end of the hallway, near the door to my office, where the noise from the party became a murmur. She turned to face me, and the working smile did something I hadn't seen it do before. It sharpened. "I want to talk to you about the house," she said. I waited. "Nathan and I have been talking about where we're going to settle. Charlotte is fine, but it's not permanent. This house," she glanced around with a gesture that managed to encompass everything, "is the kind of place where you raise a family, where things actually get built. It's a good house," I said. "We'd like it to be our house," she said, pleasantly, evenly, like she was asking me to pass the salt. The word "we" landed the way it was meant to, as if Nathan were part of this conversation, as if this had been discussed between the two of them and she was merely delivering their joint position. I said, "Nathan hasn't mentioned anything like that to me. He's nervous about asking." She tilted her head slightly. "He doesn't like to ask you for things. You have a certain effect on him." She paused. "I don't have that problem." "I can see that," I said. She smiled. Then she said, "I think it would be really meaningful for you to transfer the property to us before the wedding. As a gift. A symbol of trust." Another pause, shorter this time. "I think it would mean a great deal to Nathan." I looked at her for a moment. "And if I don't?" The smile didn't change. That was the most remarkable part. It held exactly steady while she said, Then I'll have to tell Nathan what happened the first time you and I were alone together. The things you said to me, the way you touched my arm." She let that sentence sit between us. "I don't want to do that. I don't want to cause pain. I just think it would be so much cleaner and better for everyone if we handled this like family." I stood there in the hallway of the house I had owned for 22 years. The house my wife had loved. The house where I had raised my son. And I looked at this woman who was threatening to tell my son that I had made advances toward his fiancée. And I felt something move through me that was cold and very quiet. "I'll need to think about it," I said. "Of course," she said. And she walked back toward the party, and her smile was warm again by the time she reached the living room doorway. And she took Nathan's hand and leaned into him, and he kissed the top of her head, and the string lights on the terrace made everything look like a photograph. I stood in the hallway for another 2 minutes. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it standing at the sink. The recorder in my pocket had gotten every word. I called Patricia the following Monday. I did not tell her about the conversation yet. What I asked her to do was discreet and specific. I wanted to know if a man named Simone had ever been party to any civil action in the state of North Carolina or Georgia in the past 5 years. Patricia had resources I didn't. She said she'd check. I also called Gerald again. I asked him to go back to the Atlanta engagement. I told him what I was looking for now was not just the shape of the door. I needed to know what was behind it. While I waited, life continued in the way that it does when something terrible is being kept just beneath the surface of ordinary days. Nathan called twice a week. He was happy. He was planning. He asked me once, carefully, whether I'd given any thought to the future of the house, and I understood then that some version of the conversation had made its way from Simone to him, softened, repositioned, made to sound like a natural question about estate planning. I told him I was always thinking about the future of the house. He seemed satisfied with that. I did not tell him. I want to be clear about why. It was not only because I didn't yet have everything I needed. It was because I understood that if I told Nathan what Simone had said in that hallway, before I had something irrefutable in my hand, the conversation would not be about her. It would be about me. She had constructed it that way deliberately. She had made herself the potential victim in advance, so that any accusation I made against her would read as self-defense. She was smart. I'll give her that. She had chosen her leverage carefully, and she had delivered it without raising her voice. But she had made one mistake. She had made it in a hallway instead of an empty room. She had made it to a man who had spent 4 decades outweighting people in negotiations, and she had made it to a man who had already pressed the record button. 2 weeks before the wedding, they had set a date for March, a venue in Asheville's River Arts District, a converted mill space with exposed beams and an industrial romantic aesthetic that I suspected Simone had chosen specifically because it photographed beautifully, Gerald called me. The name of the man in Atlanta was Douglas. He was 51, divorced, no children. He had been engaged to Simone for 9 months before the engagement dissolved. Gerald had found a paralegal who had worked adjacently to the case. The story, told in careful pieces over a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, was this. Simone had asked Douglas, over the course of several months, to add her name to various accounts and assets as a gesture of commitment, framing each request as a milestone of their relationship. When Douglas finally agreed to transfer a share of a vacation property to her, it had taken her 6 months of patient incremental pressure to get him there. She immediately began pressuring him to increase the transfer. When he resisted, she threatened to tell his employer that he had been emotionally abusive during the relationship. His employer was a defense contractor with security clearances. The threat carried weight that had nothing to do with whether it was true. Douglas had paid to make her go away. The NDA was tight. But it existed. Patricia, working on my other request, found something that Gerald hadn't caught. Simone's employer, the boutique hospitality brand, had been quietly closed down 11 months earlier. It no longer existed. She was not currently employed. Whatever she had told Nathan about her career, it was not the truth. Someone was indeed paying her rent, and Patricia, following the corporate trail with a patience I deeply respected, found a registered LLC in South Carolina with Simone listed as a member. The LLC had one disclosed asset, a short-term investment account. The funding source for that account traced back, through 2 layers, to Douglas's settlement. She had left Atlanta with her payout, formed her own company as a vehicle to hold it, and was now running the same play in Charlotte. Nathan was not her first. He was her second, and if I did nothing, he would not be her last. I sat with this information for 3 days. I thought about it the way I used to think about structural problems in buildings, not with emotion, but with geometry. What were the load-bearing elements? Where was the failure point? What needed to be in place before I made a move? What needed to be in place was Nathan. I called my son on a Wednesday evening and asked him to drive up to Asheville that weekend. Not for dinner, I said. I just wanted to talk. He heard something in my voice and asked if everything was okay. I told him I hoped so. He arrived Saturday morning, looking slightly pale. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and I told him I had something important to show him, and that I needed him to look at everything I had before he responded to any of it. He nodded. I saw him brace himself. I put it all in front of him. Gerald's research, Patricia's findings, the LLC documents, the Atlanta situation, as much of it as I could tell. And then I took out my phone and I played him the recording from the engagement party hallway. When the recording ended, the kitchen was completely quiet. Nathan sat with his hands around his coffee mug for a long time. He was not crying. He was doing the thing he used to do as a child when something hurt badly enough that he decided to be very still instead, as if stillness could contain it. I had watched him be still like that when his mother died. I watched him be still like that now. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "I've had suspicions since September," I said. "I've had evidence since Wednesday." He looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because she had already prepared a story about me," I said. "If I'd come to you with suspicions and no proof, the first thing she would have done was play that card. I needed you to hear her voice saying it before I said anything about it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I loved her." "I know you did," I said. He stopped. He set down the mug. "It doesn't matter what I still." I reached across the table and put my hand on his. He didn't pull away. He was 28 years old, and he had just learned something about himself that no father wants his son to learn, that love can be a door held open by someone who is standing on the other side, waiting for you to walk through, and that kindness can be cataloged and exploited, that the world sometimes sends you exactly the wound you were least prepared to receive. "What do we do?" he asked. "We handle it correctly," I said, "and we do it together." What we did was not impulsive. Patricia guided the process. The recording was the foundation. Simone had made a specific verbal threat to extort property through false accusation that was, on its face, criminal extortion. Patricia reached out to an attorney who specialized in fraud cases. The Atlanta situation, though sealed, provided a pattern that the attorney said would be relevant to any proceeding. Douglas reached through intermediaries and offered a carefully worded inquiry. Turned out to have been waiting for years for someone to give him a reason to speak. He agreed to provide a sworn affidavit. Simone did not know any of this was coming. She found out on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the wedding, when Nathan called her and said he needed to meet her for breakfast. She arrived at the restaurant near her apartment, looking beautiful and slightly curious, and carrying the small purse she always carried when she expected a conversation that required her to be prepared. Nathan was already there. So was Patricia. So was the attorney. And so, sitting at the far end of the table, was me. She stopped at the door of the restaurant and looked at the table, and I watched her read it the way someone reads a room when they understand in 1 second that the math has changed. The working smile came out. It came out and held for exactly 2 seconds before she assessed that there was no audience here that needed to see it, and then it went away, and what replaced it was something much more honest. She sat down. She did not speak. The attorney explained what we had. He was methodical and quiet, and he did not editorialize. He laid it out the way good attorneys lay things out as an architecture, each piece load-bearing, each piece visible. The recording, the Atlanta affidavit, the LLC, the defunct employer, the rent, the pattern. Simone looked at the table in front of her. Then she looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at her and did not say anything and did not look away. "What do you want?" she said. Not to Nathan, to me. "I want my son's name off the guest list for a wedding that is not going to happen," I said. "I want every key and access code to any property associated with my family returned by end of business Monday. And I want you to understand that if you make any statement, public or private, that constitutes the threat you made in my hallway in December, this recording and the affidavit from Atlanta become the first two documents filed in a criminal complaint." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The apartment lease has 3 more months." "We're not paying your rent," I said. She nodded slowly. She looked at Nathan one more time. He was still looking at her. There was something in his expression I recognized. Not anger, not grief exactly. It was the look of someone cataloging a loss carefully, storing it somewhere it can be learned from. She picked up her purse. She stood. She walked out of the restaurant without speaking again. We sat at the table for a while after she left. The attorney said he would follow up on the key situation. Patricia said she would monitor for anything that looked like retaliation. I said thank you to both of them. When they had gone, Nathan and I were left alone at the table with 2 cups of coffee and the particular silence that follows something you cannot undo. "Are you okay?" I asked him. "No," he said. "But I will be." That was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say in months. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nathan canceled the venue, the vendors, the catered rehearsal dinner. He made the calls himself. He did not ask me to do it for him. He sat with the social difficulty of explaining to friends and colleagues that the engagement was over without providing a story that would require him to relitigate everything publicly. He handled it with a quiet dignity that made me recognize, for the first time, something in him that was more mine than I'd realized. The capacity to absorb a hard thing and keep standing. He moved back to Asheville for the spring. Not because I asked him to, I would not have asked him to, but because he said he wanted some distance from Charlotte while he reset. He worked remotely for his firm. He went on runs in the mornings and cooked dinner in the evenings, and we talked more than we had in years. Sometimes we talked about Simone. Mostly we didn't. Mostly we talked about projects he was designing, buildings he wanted to build someday, the kind of structures that would last longer than the people who built them. He asked me once why I hadn't told him what I'd found when I first found it, back in September, before the engagement, before any of it had gone as far as it went. I said, "Because I wanted to be wrong." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Were you ever worried I wouldn't believe you?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I might not have," he admitted. "Not back then. I know. So you waited until you had something I couldn't argue with." "I waited until I had something she couldn't argue with," I said. "That's different." He thought about that. "You protected me from a fight you knew you'd lose." "I protected both of us," I said. "There's a difference between protecting someone and enabling them. I hope you understand that difference now." He looked at me. "I think I'm starting to." There was a woman I had not mentioned yet. I almost didn't mention her, because she is not the center of this story, and I am not a man who makes himself the center of things. But she was part of what happened, and leaving her out would be a different kind of dishonesty. Her name was Diane, Simone's mother, the quiet woman who had shaken my hand at the engagement party with both of hers and told me she'd heard so much about me. She reached out in February, 3 months after the engagement ended, through a mutual acquaintance who had been at the party and had apparently stayed in contact with her. Her message to me was short. She said she had learned what her daughter had done. She said she was not surprised and she was sorry. She said she had been trying to reach Nathan to apologize to him directly, but understood if he preferred no contact. She asked if I would be willing to speak with her briefly, not to excuse anything, simply to say what she needed to say. I thought about it for a week. Then I said yes. We met for coffee at a place on the north end of Asheville, Neutral Ground, a Tuesday morning in late February when the sky was the pale gray that presides over winter's last weeks before it gives anything up. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her hands around a mug, looking at the table. When she looked up, she looked tired in the way that people look when they have been carrying something for a long time. She said she had known about the Atlanta situation for years. She said she had tried, more than once, to intervene, to redirect, to help her daughter find a different path, and that each attempt had made her daughter angrier and moved them further apart. She said there was nothing she could offer that would undo what had happened to Nathan, and she was not asking for forgiveness, only for the chance to acknowledge that it had happened, and that she knew it had happened, and that it mattered. I listened to all of it. I believed it. I have been in enough rooms with enough people to distinguish between a performance and an accounting. When she finished, she looked at the table again and said she was sorry for taking up my morning. I said, "You haven't taken up anything." We sat there for a while longer. She asked about Nathan. I told her he was doing well, that he was building something back, that he was going to be fine in the way that people are fine when they come through something hard with their character intact. She smiled at that. Not the working smile I had watched her daughter use. A real one, brief and a little sad, and entirely genuine. I am 63 years old. I am not looking for anything, but I am also not immune to the reality that some of the most meaningful things in a life arrive at the door you least expected to open. I called her the following week to ask if she would like to have coffee again. Just coffee, nothing more than that. She said yes. Nathan found out several months later. In the way that adult children find things out when they are living in the same house as their parent gradually, through small, accumulated evidence, a second coffee mug in the dish rack, a laugh I had on the phone that he hadn't heard from me in a long time. He sat across from me at the kitchen table one evening and gave me a look that was so precisely his mother's look, the patient, let's be honest with each other look, that I had to take a breath before I answered. "Simone's mother?" he said. "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "That's a little complicated, Dad." "I know. Are you happy?" I thought about it honestly. "I think so. Yes." He was quiet again. I waited for the rest of it, whatever the rest of it was. He picked up his coffee and looked at the window and said, "I guess I can't really argue with complicated right now." "You don't have to argue with anything," I said. "No." He set down his mug. "I know." He was quiet for one more moment. Then something in his face relaxed, not into happiness exactly, but into the kind of peace that comes after you have carried something as far as you can carry it and finally set it down somewhere it can rest. "Okay," he said. "Tell me about her." So I told him. I told him the part where she had apologized without asking for anything, the part where she had looked tired in the way that people look when they have been carrying something for a long time, the part where she had smiled and it was brief and a little sad and entirely genuine. He listened to all of it. He nodded at the end. "She sounds like the kind of person," he said carefully, "who would shake your hand with both of hers." "She does do that," I said. He almost smiled. "Okay," he said again, softer this time. That night I stood at the kitchen window, the way I sometimes stand at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard where the oak trees Margaret planted are still standing, bare now and waiting for spring. I thought about what I had protected, and what I had lost, and what I had found, and what I was still finding. I thought about how the best structures are the ones that can absorb force without breaking, not because they are rigid, but because they know where their load-bearing walls are, and they protect them absolutely, and they don't apologize for it. Nathan came into the kitchen and stood beside me at the window for a minute, without saying anything. Then he said, "What are you thinking about?" "The yard," I said. Which was true, which was also not entirely the truth. He looked out at it with me. The oak trees, the last of the winter light. "The big one on the left is leaning," he said. He had an architect's eye for angles that were slightly off. "Has been for a while." "I know," I said. "You should probably have someone look at it." "I probably should." We stood there a little longer, the two of us, and the house was quiet around us the way houses go quiet in the evening when the people in them have finally stopped performing and started simply being. And that quiet felt like something I had built, not in an afternoon, but over decades, with patience and stubbornness and the willingness to wait until I had something irrefutable in my hand before I said a word. My son was standing next to me. He was 28 and intact, and still willing to come home when things got hard. Some things you build, some things you protect. Sometimes, if you're lucky, they turn out to be the same thing.